So usually when we unpack, a political manifesto or a partisan essay on this deep dive, there's this expectation of a predictable, almost comforting kind of cheerleading.
Right, yeah, like a team sport.
Exactly. It feels like a team sport. You put on your jersey, you glance up at the scoreboard, and the writer simply points at the opposing team and declares, there is the enemy.
hmm
It's safe.
Yeah, it's a binary, clean, us versus them framework that allows people to just neatly categorize their political tribalism into these familiar little boxes.
But that familiar structure completely breaks down when you step into the world of really radical fringe political ideologies.
Yeah.
I mean, the political landscape today has fractured to a point where the scoreboard itself it's basically on fire.
It really is.
The ideological waters are so muddy right now that the most vicious existential threats aren't even perceived as coming from the opposing party anymore. They're coming from inside the author's own ideological house. And that internal civil war, that's our singular focus today. So
Yeah.
for you listening, our mission right now is to dissect a highly provocative, deeply controversial political essay that's been circulating in the spring of 2026.
Right.
It's simply titled The End of the Right. And this document, it serves as this raw, totally unvarnished autopsy of the political right, written by a highly radical faction.
Yeah, and it covers a massive amount of ground.
Oh, it covers everything from the current United States war with Iran, which the author refers to as Operation Epic Fury, to the geopolitical fallout of the Epstein files, the brutal philosophies of immigration, and just this sweeping, incredibly cynical takedown of Donald Trump's second term.
But I need to jump in here right away because before we delve into the mechanics of this essay, we really must establish our operational ground rules for this deep dive.
Absolutely. Go ahead.
The source material we are analyzing today contains highly politically charged content. I mean, it features extreme viewpoints, fringe geopolitical theories, and very controversial offensive rhetoric regarding race, religion, immigration, and global politics.
Yeah, it's intense.
It is. The text contains explicit anti-Semitism and radical nationalist talking points. So, to be crystal clear to you, the listener, neither of us nor anyone associated with this analysis endorses, validates, or supports literally any of the viewpoints presented in this document.
Not a single one. Our approach today is strictly anthropological. I mean, think of us as researchers in a controlled laboratory, right? We're examining a highly volatile chemical compound.
That's a great way to put it.
Our job is to impartially report on the content, decode the author's specific arguments, and really just help you understand the severely fractured state of political ideologies as they are presented in this text.
Right, we are exploring the underlying logic of what this radical faction believes and why they believe it. We are definitely not validating the truth or the morality of those beliefs.
Exactly. Because, understanding the current political moment often requires reading the exact materials that make you intensely uncomfortable.
Yeah, you have to look at the ugly stuff to understand the mechanics.
So let's get into the hook of this entire essay. The central paradox that makes it such a fascinating psychological study is its view of Donald Trump.
It's quite a pivot.
It's a massive pivot. For over a decade, Trump has been considered the ultimate standard bearer of the global right. Yet this radical nationalist author views him as a weak, and they use the word schizophrenic leader who has utterly and perhaps permanently destroyed the right-wing movement.
The reversal is just stunning to read. The author actually begins by detailing their initial fervent support for Trump.
Wait, they were supporters at first?
Oh, massive supporters. They didn't just see him as a politician. They saw him as a unique, once-in-a-generation uniting force. The working theory was that Trump could fuse the massive electoral power of the mainstream conservative right with the ideological teeth of the radical nationalist right.
So, the mainstream provides the votes, and the radicals provide the actual policy.
Exactly. Mainstream conservatives would provide the sheer numbers needed to win the elections, and the radicals would dictate the sweeping policy changes behind closed doors.
Okay, I see.
The author believed this coalition was poised to enact genuine change globally because, they recognize that American cultural and political influence acts as a universal exporter.
Right. If America shifts radically, the Western world follows suit.
Precisely. But that theoretical coalition completely shattered for the author. And the breaking point, this is what's wild, it wasn't a failure to pass a specific piece of legislation or a disappointing Supreme Court ruling.
Right.
The author, who actually happens to be Canadian, claims their support evaporated the exact moment Trump started bloviating, that's their specific word, about the annexation of Canada and buying Greenland.
Okay, let me try to build out an analogy here for you listening, just to understand the psychological shift happening. Imagine hiring a driver to operate a massive bulldozer for the explicit purpose of knocking down the walls of your political enemies.
Okay, I like this.
Right. So for a while, the arrangement is fantastic. The bulldozer is destroying the institutions you hate, and all your supporters are cheering. But suddenly, the driver gets erratic, spins the bulldozer around, and points it directly at your own house.
Yeah.
The chaotic destruction is no longer a useful political tool. It becomes an unpredictable existential threat. Because normalizing extreme rhetoric about annexing a sovereign ally like Canada, it pushes your international allies into a state of panic and turns the weapon inward.
That captures the terror of unpredictability perfectly. The author fully acknowledges that Trump's statements about annexing Canada or buying Greenland weren't like formal policy positions.
Right, they were just tweets or rally comments.
Yeah, they were likely off-the-cuff remarks, negotiation bluster, or media manipulation. However, the author argues that the words of an American president carry immense, terrifying geopolitical weight.
Because even if it's a joke, it enters the global conversation.
Exactly. If you normalize the concept of annexing Canada, even as a joke over decades, that idea germinates in the public consciousness. It becomes politically viable to the general public. To the author, this rhetoric exposed a fatal decline in Trump's competency and vision. They think it completely discredited the global right because its supposed leader sounded totally unhinged to his international counterparts.
And the text claims this rhetoric fundamentally altered the geopolitical relationship between the United States and Europe, right?
It did.
The author uses a very specific, historically loaded term here. They point out that before Trump, European states were essentially loyal vassals to Washington.
Vassals is a strong word.
It is. It implies a complete lack of true sovereignty, right? Like a subservience where American foreign policy basically dictates European action.
Yeah, but Trump's threats terrified European leadership to such an extreme degree that the author claims British officials were actually contemplating a NATO without the United States.
Wait, seriously?
Yes, or even preparing for the theoretical possibility of fighting a war against America.
I have to pause on that because that just sounds completely detached from reality. A European military alliance against the U.S.
It sounds absurd, yeah.
But I suppose the author's point is really about the shifting window of discourse. I mean, in the 2010s, a European leader suggesting military opposition to the U.S. would be laughed right out of office.
Oh, absolutely.
But because of Trump's demands, an anti-American platform could suddenly see real political traction in Europe.
Right, and the author actually experiences a massive internal conflict regarding this shift. Ideologically, this radical nationalist wants Europe and Canada to be sovereign.
Oh, interesting. Why?
Because they despise American hegemony. They view America as a primary exporter of liberal left-wing ideology. So in theory, European independence from Washington should be a massive victory for this author.
So why does the author frame it as the strategic failure then, if they got what they wanted?
The failure lies in the timing and the nature of the shift. Detaching Europe from American influence should have been a careful generational process, aimed at building authentic, right-wing nationalist states that preserve their unique civilizations.
Okay.
Instead, Trump accelerated the detachment chaotically. Because this new European sovereignty was born entirely out of a desperate reaction against Trump, it took on what the author calls a left-wing character.
Oh, okay.
They use the specific term managerial leftism.
Okay, let's definitely define managerial leftism for the listener, because that phrase does a lot of heavy lifting in fringe political theory.
It really does. So in political science, the managerial state refers to a system where true power isn't held by elected politicians at all.
Right, it's held by the bureaucrats.
Exactly. An unelected class of bureaucrats, corporate managers, academics, and media executives. The author argues that Europe and Canada didn't break away to become traditional nations. They broke away to heavily entrench this liberal bureaucratic class simply to prove how anti-Trump they were.
So Trump effectively poisoned the well for authentic right-wing nationalists globally.
Precisely. Now, if a European politician advocates for loving their nation and preserving its borders, the managerial class immediately smears them as a Trumpian puppet, even if that politician actively despises Trump.
Trump just became the ultimate boogeyman.
Right. And in doing so, he handed the left a permanent rhetorical weapon.
That perfectly sets the stage for the domestic front, specifically the text's grim autopsy of the Minnesota ICE test case.
Yes, this part is incredibly dark.
Very. So the author describes actions taken by Immigration and Customs Enforcement in Minnesota as heavily repressive, resulting in the deaths of two individuals named Renee Good and Jonathan Ross. And the author's reaction to these deaths is completely devoid of conventional human empathy. I mean, they ruthlessly and pragmatically state they neither celebrate nor mourn these deaths.
They view Good and Ross purely as political enemies who, in their words, threw their lives away for nothing.
Which is chilling.
It is. The author views the heavy-handed IC actions not as a tragedy or a mistake, but as a necessary test case. They wanted to see if the Trump administration had the stomach to actually utilize state violence to achieve what the author believes is the ultimate requirement.
Which is mass deportation.
Yes. For a brief moment, the text notes, there was a normalization of state violence against both illegal and citizen alike.
Let me challenge the author's logic here for a second. The text heavily criticizes Trump for backing down after the massive public and media backlash to these ICE actions. But in the reality of democratic systems, if a policy results in domestic casualties and national riots, a leader retreats. That isn't weakness, it's basic political calculus to survive the next election cycle. Is this author just completely detached from the reality of getting reelected?
Yes, entirely detached, because their definition of politics is fundamentally different.
How so?
For this radical faction, politics isn't about compromise or managing public opinion or, winning a 51% majority. It is a zero-sum existential war for demographic survival.
Wow.
The author explicitly states, in the real world, politics cannot help but be distasteful. They truly believe violence and repression are necessary tools.
So by initiating state violence and then retreating when his poll numbers dropped, Trump committed the ultimate sin in their eyes.
He committed a strategic catastrophe. The author argues Trump failed to finish the job, thereby failing to secure any long-term demographic goals.
Right.
But much worse, by initiating the violence in the first place, he handed massive, unprecedented legal and cultural precedents to the left.
Oh, I see. Because he opened Pandora's box.
Exactly. The author writes that when the left inevitably takes power again, they will utilize all the executive orders, the bureaucratic rulemaking, and the cultural normalization of state force established by Trump, and they will use it to ruthlessly crush their political enemies on the right.
So Trump should have used those powers to utterly destroy the left's power base while he had the chance.
According to the author, yes. Because he possessed only half measures, because he pushed just far enough to enrage his enemies but relented at the moment of decision, he basically ensured the left will use his own heavy-handed tactics against the right in the future.
So to them, he isn't a strong man. He's a weak man playing dress-up who handed a loaded weapon to his enemies and then immediately surrendered.
That's exactly how they see it.
And this total disillusionment with Trump's administrative failures, it bleeds perfectly into the author's attack on the very foundation of mainstream conservatism, specifically regarding demographics and immigration.
This is a really crucial part of the essay.
The text takes direct aim at the conservative establishment's focus on illegal immigration. We hear this constantly in mainstream discourse, right? We love legal immigrants. We just want people to respect our laws and do it the right way.
Yeah, the classic conservative talking point.
But the author calls this entirely performative.
Performative and cowardly, yeah. The author completely strips away any pretense of civic nationalism.
Civic nationalism being the idea that anyone can be an American if they believe in the Constitution and follow the laws.
Right. They claim that when mainstream conservatives decry illegal immigration, it is merely a socially acceptable, safe word game. It's a way to signal their opposition to the browning of America without being labeled racist.
The author states unabashedly that the radical right does not care about the legal status of an immigrant.
Not at all.
A piece of paper from the federal government doesn't change anything for them.
The text is shockingly explicit about this. They argue the cultural and identitarian injury that non-European immigrants bring to Western society is not mitigated simply because they waited in line for a visa.
This is a pure ethno-nationalist manifesto.
It absolutely is. The text states the true goal is an America that is a supermajority white demographically and governed in the interests of that nation.
And the author actually gives the political left credit for seeing through the right's performative word games, don't they?
They do. They point out that the left denounces those who oppose illegal immigration as racist because the left realizes mechanically there is no functional difference between legal and illegal immigrant classes when it comes to diversifying and altering the demographic makeup of a nation.
Here is where the author introduces a deeply cynical sociological theory. They argue that both the managerial left and the managerial right, the establishments of both major parties, ultimately desired the exact same dystopian outcome.
Yeah, this is a fascinating twist in their logic.
They claim both establishments actively want a country housing countless ethnic and religious communities that are so utterly alien to one another that natural social cohesion becomes impossible.
The mechanism behind this theory is entirely about state control. Sociological studies often show that highly diverse, fragmented societies can suffer from lower social trust.
Right.
The author weaponizes this concept. They argue that the more fractured a society becomes, the less citizens can rely on organic community bonds, shared cultural heritage, or mutual trust.
And when that organic cohesion fails, the population becomes alienated and isolated.
Exactly, and consequently, the state is compelled to step in. The government must exert direct authoritarian control over a population that is now totally dependent upon the state to mediate every single dispute.
Wow.
The author claims this deliberate fragmentation leads to the creation of new bureaucracies and laws that govern not just physical actions, but words and thought.
So in this framework, diversity isn't a moral good promoted by the left out of empathy, nor is it an economic good promoted by the right to secure cheap labor for corporations. It is a deliberate, structural mechanism designed to create a fragmented populace easily subjugated by an authoritarian government.
That is their exact argument.
Which explains the twist that initially shocked me the most in this document. The author actually harbors a deeper hatred for mainstream conservatives than they do for the radical left.
The hatred for conservatives is palpable on every page of the text.
I picture the author's view kind of like this. The radical left is a massive, visible, bleeding wound on the body politic.
Right.
You look at it and you know exactly what it is. It's dangerous. It's trying to kill you, but it's entirely honest about its nature. You can see it, diagnose it, and fight it openly.
Right.
Mainstream conservatism, however, is like an invisible systemic infection. It masquerades as healthy tissue. It tells you everything is fine, offers you a painkiller, and just tells you to ignore the underlying rot.
That's a brutal analogy, but it's incredibly accurate to the text. The author argues conservatives espouse right-wing values on television, but they never, ever implement them in reality.
And why do they never implement them?
The reason, according to the text, is purely economic. Implementing authentic, radical nationalist policies would utterly destroy the current globalized economic system.
Right.
The conservative establishment's only true objective is preserving the economic status quo to protect the wealth of what the author calls the moneyed caste.
The moneyed caste.
Yeah. The text states, and I'll quote this directly, "The conservative seeks to preserve the system as it is, a system which is disenfranchising and working towards the destruction of our nation and culture. This is not a system I wish to see conserved."
To the radical right, mainstream conservatives are treacherous because they act as a pressure valve, basically neutralizing revolutionary energy.
Exactly. They promise salvation to the working class, but consistently deliver managed decline.
So if Trump is a failure and conservatives are an infection, who serves as the model for this author?
The text points to a British figure named Rupert Lowe and his movement, Restore Britain.
And the author finds Lowe refreshing, specifically because his platform is divorced from the empty promises of Trumpian populism.
Yes.
And more importantly, because Lowe is honest about the brutal economic costs of his ideology.
Right. Let's deduce what those costs must be. If Lowe is the ideal, and he completely rejects the conservative obsession with GDP, his policies must be promising profound economic ruin in exchange for demographic purity.
You've hit the core of the radical calculus there. Lowe apparently admits that his nationalist policies, mass deportations, shutting down globalized trade, prioritizing ethnic identity over corporate profits, it would abolish the status quo and cause severe immediate economic hardships.
He openly states that his policies would cause a drastic decline in the British quality of life.
Which is an insane political platform to run on.
It is, yet he argues those severe hardships are worth persevering through if the British demographic identity is preserved.
So a poorer, technologically stunted, economically struggling Britain with a drastically reduced population is viewed as vastly superior to a wealthy, bustling, globalized Britain that has become an island of strangers.
Yes. The author is entirely willing to sacrifice capitalism, personal wealth, and modern comfort on the altar of demographic purity.
They argue that economic metrics are transitory, but demographics are permanent destiny.
It is a fundamental, violent rejection of the entire post-WWII Western democratic consensus, which prioritizes economic growth and individual liberty above all else.
It is an austere, just punishing ideology. And this realization that the conservative policy apparatus is failing logically forces the author to examine the actual individuals making those policies.
Right, which brings us to a really dark section of the essay.
Yeah, this transition brings us to the profound, sickening moral corruption at the highest levels of the political right, specifically focusing on the release of the Jeffrey Epstein files.
Now, most of the public views Jeffrey Epstein simply as a monster, a prolific sexual predator who ran a blackmail ring purely for his own protection and perversion.
Right, that's the mainstream consensus.
The author, however, views Epstein as a fundamental structural pillar of the global elite. They actually downplay the blackmail aspect slightly.
Really?
Yeah. While they acknowledge he recorded encounters as insurance, they argue his criminal actions were almost secondary to his primary function within the ruling class.
So to the author, Epstein was the ultimate intermediary for political and economic elites.
Exactly. If two immensely powerful parties, let's say a foreign intelligence agency and an American tech billionaire, wanted to do business but required absolute plausible deniability, they went through Epstein.
He was the gatekeeper to a highly profitable, highly exclusive network.
The text bluntly states, you wanted to know Epstein because he could make connections that were profitable to you.
And the illicit activities, the horrific abuse of young girls, they're described almost as a sickening prerequisite or a perk of doing business in this tier of society.
Yeah.
Like a dark ritual that bonded the elite together in shared complicity, ensuring mutual silence.
It gets even deeper. The author goes further, heavily asserting that Epstein was working as a formal agent for the Mossad, the Israeli intelligence agency.
Wow.
They paint a picture of a ruling elite in the democratic capitalist West that is completely morally bankrupt, entirely tolerant of this extreme degeneracy so long as it facilitates their retention of power and wealth.
And this is where the author turns their intense fury back onto the populist right. The sense of betrayal is absolute when they examine the associations their supposed heroes had with this network.
Yeah, they specifically target Steve Bannon.
Right. And the author admits they genuinely respected Bannon during Trump's first term. They bought books based on his endorsement and basically formed core political beliefs around his teachings.
So the revelation in the Epstein files that Bannon was in close communication with Epstein, allegedly working with him to shift public opinion, it was a devastating psychological blow to the author.
I can imagine.
The author notes a twisted, bitter irony here. Epstein apparently held realist views on race in private that aligned with the radical right.
Wait, really?
Yeah. So you have this elite broker whom the author views as the ultimate enemy, secretly championing right-wing concepts behind closed doors while effortlessly manipulating right-wing populist leaders like Bannon.
But the deepest cut, naturally, is Donald Trump himself.
Oh, the author is entirely unsparing when it comes to Trump.
They highlight Trump as a known associate and former friend of Epstein, noting Trump's reputation in the 80s and 90s as a high society womanizer.
They theorize that Trump and Epstein bonded deeply over their shared lasciviousness. They even reference the claim that Epstein introduced Trump to his current wife, Melania.
The author essentially assumes Trump is guilty by association, or at the very least, culturally complicit.
Right, they write, it is highly likely Trump engaged in inappropriate relations during that era and wouldn't have even considered it a major moral concern at the time.
This assumption leads the author into a deeply bizarre, yet analytically deliberate, detour into 1970s cinema.
Yeah, let's talk about that.
I found this section extremely jarring. Reading a political manifesto about the collapse of the right and suddenly encountering paragraphs analyzing Clint Eastwood and Brooke Shields movies, it feels like a fever dream.
It does, but it serves a specific purpose in the author's attempt to contextualize Trump's behavior. They are indicting the entire high society culture of the 1970s and 80s.
Right.
The author cites specific films. The Beguiled from 1971, where Clint Eastwood's character kisses a 12-year-old. The 1978 film Pretty Baby, starring a young Brooke Shields. The 1977 European film Malata-Licenza.
The author is highlighting that these critically acclaimed films featured highly inappropriate sexualized depictions of minors.
Exactly. And the author uses a chilling comparison to make their point. They say if a random working-class person behaves this way, he is prosecuted as a pervert.
But if a sophisticated, wealthy gentleman produces it or engages in it, high society calls it artful.
Right. The author's argument is that during the exact era when Donald Trump was establishing himself in New York high society, this kind of extreme degeneracy wasn't just occurring in the shadows, it was actively promoted.
It was normalized and celebrated as sophisticated art by the cultural elite.
Yes. So Trump is framed not as a working-class hero fighting against the swamp, but as a creature forged in the very swamp the radical right wants to drain.
The conclusion the author draws from this is devastating for the political right as a movement. Because the populist right figures like Trump and Bannon are so deeply intertwined with Epstein's network, the public now views right-wing ideas as inherently dangerous.
It's not just guilt by association. The public perception is that right-wing ideology itself appeals to defective, dangerous people.
The movement has suffered a total loss of the moral high ground.
The author believes the authentic right has been irrevocably tarnished, and this profound moral decay at home directly facilitates the catastrophic geopolitical disaster outlined in the next major phase of the document.
Right, which is a massive shift in scale. The author transitions from the shadowy influence of Epstein's network to a literal shooting war in the Middle East.
The text outlines the state of the world in the spring of 2026. America is currently engaged in a massive, devastating military conflict with Iran, officially designated by the U.S. government as Operation Epic Fury.
But the author notes that dissidents online have darkly rebranded it, Epstein's Fury.
Which is a heavy rebrand.
It is. The author claims this war was entirely orchestrated by Israeli interests, facilitated by the exact same deep state actors, intelligence agencies, and neoconservatives who protected Epstein.
The author details a highly specific conspiratorial narrative regarding the war's origins. They claim the Pentagon has Mossad and IDF representatives actively embedded within its ranks, feeding manipulated intelligence to the Americans.
For instance, the author claims that the intelligence suggesting Iran was plotting to assassinate Donald Trump was actually fabricated or at least heavily distorted by Israeli sources to force Trump's hand into initiating a conflict. What was the specific spark that ignited the full-scale conflict, according to the text?
The assassination of Ayatollah Khamenei, Iran's supreme leader. The author states that Western intelligence and Israel believed a decapitation strike, killing the absolute top leader, would lead to the immediate chaotic internal collapse of the Islamic Republic.
The assumption being that the Iranian people, supposedly crushed under the weight of an oppressive regime, would instantly rise up and overthrow the government the moment Khamenei was dead.
But the text notes this was a massive miscalculation.
A huge one.
The author points out that contrary to Western media narratives about the unbearable hardships of Islamic rule, the majority of the Iranian populace, even religious and ethnic minorities who might dislike the regime, actually rallied behind their government when faced with a foreign invasion.
And the author makes a profoundly realist sociological observation here. They write, "So long as a certain standard of living is maintained, the masses will always prefer stability over the potential offerings of a revolutionary movement."
It perfectly explains the threshold of stability in authoritarian regimes. The fear of anarchy and foreign domination often outweighs the desire for liberal democracy.
So because the Iranian state did not collapse, the U.S. and Israel find themselves trapped in a massive conventional war. And Trump, refusing to look weak after his domestic retreats, has demanded the unconditional surrender of Iran.
Unconditional surrender. Those are terms reserved for total war, like the destruction of Germany or Japan in World War II.
Exactly. By demanding unconditional surrender from a proud, heavily armed nation, Trump's forcing Iran into a fight to the death.
The author laments that America is attempting the total destruction of a 5,000-year-old civilization. A civilization that, the author makes sure to note, contributed heavily to the philosophical and religious development of Christianity.
And the author actually expresses a begrudging, fascinating admiration for Iran here, don't they?
They really do. It's the ultimate enemy of my enemy logic. The radical right-wing nationalist author sympathizes with the Islamic Republic because they both share a common enemy. The Western liberal Zionist elite, which the author calls the Epstein Empire.
The military strategy detailed in the text is what truly enrages the author, though. The claim is that America is literally sacrificing its own global allies to protect Israel.
Yes.
Let's look at the logistics of global hegemony here. It is like a chess player who is so obsessively focused on protecting one specific pawn on the board that they voluntarily sacrifice their rooks, their knights, and leave their king entirely exposed to do it.
The tactical picture painted by the author is exactly that desperate. The text claims America removed crucial Patriot and THAAD air defense systems from the Gulf states.
Essentially abandoning its vital Arab monarchy allies.
Yes, and moved them to protect Israel. This left American citizens, military bases, and soldiers in the Gulf completely exposed to absorb missile and drone attacks from Iran.
And the text mentions they stripped air defenses from East Asia, too.
They did.
Moving air defense systems out of South Korea to send them to the Middle East, that leaves a massive, crucial ally completely vulnerable to a potential first strike from North Korea.
To the author, this proves America is incinerating its global prestige, its strategic deterrence, and the safety of its allies, while receiving absolutely nothing in return.
They even cite a quote from Mike Huckabee from 2026, where he allegedly suggests it would be fine if Israel expanded and took the whole region.
Right. And the author uses that quote to argue this isn't a defensive war to protect an ally. It is an expansionist, regional war subsidized entirely by American blood, treasure, and global standing.
The author heavily aligns themselves with commentator Tucker Carlson here, noting that this war is a needlessly dangerous endeavor that will inevitably expand into a deliberate quagmire.
We can see the geopolitical domino effect clearly here. The author draws a direct parallel to the Ukraine war.
Right, arguing that America sought to use Ukraine to trap Russia in a draining, unwinnable conflict.
Exactly. And now they predict Russia and China will use Iran to inflict the exact same damage on the United States.
Moscow and Beijing will fund and supply Iran with just enough advanced weaponry to bleed the American military dry without triggering a direct superpower confrontation.
The human and economic costs are projected to be devastating. The author laments that Iranian Christians will be completely destroyed in the crossfire.
They predict massive global fuel shortages that will cripple Europe and American allies in Asia, like Japan.
Tragically, the author notes that prior to this war, there was growing internal discontent with hardline Islam inside Iran, and Christianity was quietly growing.
Oh, wow.
But this war, the author believes, will end that organic cultural shift. If Iran survives the conflict, the population will become violently entrenched in hardline Shia Islam due to the trauma of fighting off what the author categorizes as a war of genocide.
It is a completely apocalyptic vision, and the author pulls all these threads together: the domestic failures, the moral corruption of the Epstein network, and the catastrophic geopolitical disaster in Iran to deliver their final, incredibly bleak prognosis for the political right.
It all builds to this.
They start by referencing a theory from a commentator named Jay Burden, known as the Samson option theory.
Right. The Samson option theory posits that prior to the outbreak of the Iran war, the Republican establishment was deliberately trying to sabotage their own midterm elections.
They were orchestrating a massive political loss on purpose.
Yes.
I really have to unpack the mechanics of that. Why would the leadership of a political party actively try to lose an election? It defies every law of political survival.
It makes sense only within the context of an internal civil war. Burden's theory, endorsed by the author, argues that the neoconservative Republican establishment realized they were losing control of the party to the Meiji wing. They wanted a massive electoral defeat so they could use it as a weapon to purge the party. They planned to blame the midterm losses entirely on Trump's radicalism and what they label the anti-Semitic far right.
So by throwing the midterms, the establishment leadership could finally put the populist movement away permanently and safely return the GOP to the corporate interventionist norms of Bush-era neoconservatism.
Exactly. They pull the pillars of the temple down on their own heads, just like Samson in the biblical story, specifically to crush the radical factions trapped inside the temple with them.
But the author notes that the outbreak of the war made the midterms totally irrelevant to Trump, who publicly stated he didn't care about polling anymore.
Even though the war made the midterms irrelevant, why does the author still think this theory matters?
Because it proves their ultimate paranoid thesis. The establishment right is actively, maliciously working to destroy the authentic radical right. They were surrounded by enemies on all sides, even within their own coalition.
Sitting atop this collapsing empire is Donald Trump. And the author reaches for a historical comparison for Trump's legacy that is absolutely brutal.
Let's hear it.
They conclude that Trump will not be remembered as the man who secured the border, revitalized the economy, or saved Western civilization. If he is incredibly lucky, he might be remembered as another George W. Bush or Richard Nixon, flawed, controversial, but ultimately standard presidents.
But realistically,
Realistically, the author states Trump will be remembered as America's Leonid Brezhnev.
Leonid Brezhnev. Wow. The Soviet leader who ruled during the 1970s and early 80s, that is the perfect, devastating insult from a nationalist.
It really is.
Brezhnev oversaw the era of stagnation. He was a backward-looking, increasingly senile leader who managed a period of massive bureaucratic corruption, ideological decay, and the ultimate economic and military decline of the Soviet Empire.
Right. To compare Donald Trump, a man completely obsessed with strength, branding, and winning, to the bloated, dying days of the Soviet gerontocracy, is the ultimate admission that the Meiji era is dead to them.
The author even admits something that must have been physically painful to commit to paper.
What's that?
They concede that the hysterical left and fringe far-right figures like Devin Stack were actually right about Trump all along.
It is a stunning admission of defeat. The author acknowledges that the left's predictions about Trump being a chaotic, compromised disaster came true far more often than the right's hopes for him as a savior.
And to explain this failure, the text takes a very dark turn, focusing heavily on Trump's historical and familial ties to Jewish communities.
The author points out that Trump's father, Fred Trump, built his fortune renting to Eastern European Jewish immigrants and was honored by their organizations.
They note Trump married his daughter off to the Kushner family.
The author states clearly, whether Trump is blackmailed, controlled, or just a genuine Philosemite, it is clear that Trump's ultimate loyalties are towards the Jews specifically, and to Israel in particular.
This leads to the inclusion of a quote from Cornelia Zelia Codreanu, a notorious Romanian fascist and anti-Semite from the 1930s.
Yeah, the quote is, "A country has the Jews it deserves. Just as mosquitoes can thrive and settle only in swamps, likewise the former can only thrive in the swamps of our sins."
That is incredibly dark. What is the analytical takeaway from the author choosing to include that specific historical fascist quote?
It is a profound shift in blame. While the author clearly harbors deep anti-Semitism, the quote implies that the radical right cannot simply blame external forces, the left, the media, or Jewish influence, for their defeat.
They must blame their own societal weakness.
Exactly. The swamp of our sins refers to their own embrace of weak, blustering leaders like Trump, their tolerance of elite degeneracy like the Epstein network, and their reliance on conservative economics that prioritize money over identity.
The author concludes that the conditions for their subjugation were created by the right wing itself. Everything that has happened to them was self-imposed.
That brings us to the dystopian conclusion of the essay. The picture the author paints for the next decade of the political right is one of total, inescapable disenfranchisement.
They fear that the political right will be entirely, permanently associated with Jeffrey Epstein's degeneracy, the failures of neoconservatism, and the global destruction wrought by the Iran war.
The authentic right is discredited forever in their eyes.
Worse still, they predict the federal government will utilize the wartime powers granted by Operation Epic Fury to impose draconian new restrictions on the domestic population.
They specifically fear the implementation of laws that will criminalize anti-Semitism or criminalize any criticism of Israel's influence over American foreign policy.
They note that America is currently bombing schools, undefended ships, and carpet bombing cities in Iran.
And the author argues this brutal behavior proves the current iteration of the right is antichrist in spirit and behavior.
Because of that moral rot, the author reaches their final, shocking conclusion. If this is the right, then the right should justly be defeated in Iran and electorally in the West.
We're looking at a radical nationalist who is actively praying for the military defeat of their own nation's armed forces.
And the electoral destruction of their own political faction, simply because they believe the systemic rot is too deep to save?
It represents a total ideological collapse.
It really does. We have covered a massive amount of intense, deeply troubling ground today. We've explored a highly radical document that reveals a profound, unhealable fracture on the political right in 2026.
We've seen how a faction that once viewed Donald Trump as their savior now views him as a weak, compromised, Brezhnev-like figurehead.
We've unpacked how they believe he has led America into a disastrous proxy war with Iran on behalf of elite global interests, entirely abandoning authentic nationalism in favor of moral corruption and mainstream conservative cowardice.
It stands as a profound testament to how quickly political coalitions can eat themselves alive when fundamental radical expectations are not met by democratic realities.
As we wrap up this analysis, I want to leave you, the listener, with a final provocative thought. A thread to pull on that builds on the underlying psychology we've analyzed today.
Let's hear it.
If we look at the trajectory this author is on, it raises a critical question about the future of political organization in the modern era. If radical political factions across the spectrum increasingly view their mainstream standard-bearers and the global elite as a whole as hopelessly compromised, morally bankrupt, and actively working against them,
Does this inevitably signal the end of national unified party politics altogether?
exactly. Could the future of politics bypass national leaders and federal elections entirely, retreating instead into hyper-localized, uncompromising splinter movements that operate entirely outside the traditional democratic system?
When the scoreboard catches fire and the rules of the game feel rigged, maybe people simply stop playing the game and start building their own isolated arenas.
It's a heavy thought to carry with you. Keep questioning the narratives, look for the mechanics behind the rhetoric, and we'll see you next time on The Deep Dive.